Good day. I'm Kathi Whitbey, and I'm a program manager with Unit 42 with Palo Alto Networks. Today, I am pleased to be with some wonderful people who have important insights to share with us on flattening the curve of cyber risks. Please take a moment to introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Okay, my name is Righard Zwienenberg. I'm a senior research fellow at ESET, for 30 years busy in the industry, have many functions, including on the advisory group of Europol EC3.
My name is Noortje Henrichs. I'm a coordinator at the National Cybersecurity Center in the Netherlands. I'm managing the threat intelligence teams, and that's about it.
Hi, I'm Derek Manky. I'm with FortiGuard Labs from Fortinet. I have 20 plus years experience in the industry, over 16 at Fortinet now. I lead our global threat intelligence team with FortiGuard Labs. So this is doing data science and processing of threat telemetry, but also working on our global threat alliances, including the Cyber Threat Alliance as well, of course. So very happy to be here.
Thanks, everyone. And as you can see, we have quite an array of expertise here on our panel this morning. What this panel intends to do is to shed some light on the do's and don'ts on what corporations should or should not do to flatten the curve of cyber risks, to minimize any impact on your networks, and to provide you with the necessary resilience. Noortje, let's start the conversation with the important topic of what actually makes good quality threat intelligence.
Well, Kathi, I think everybody agrees on threat intelligence, that it has to be relevant and timely, accurate, and that it has to be reliable, of course, and all those things. But I think what's really important for threat intelligence to be is that it gives information on the probability and the impact of certain digital attacks. And what I specifically look for in threat intelligence is to combine technical information, like indicators, with contextual information or tactical context, or what you want to call it. Because it's very important that you know what you're going to deal with in case of cyber attacks and who you're going to deal with. I think technical indicators are sometimes not threat intelligence at all. They give a huge amount of false positives. And I think what really gives organizations a view of the threat is this information on the modus operandi and the motives of the party behind it, and the probability that it can get into their systems as well.
Okay. Derek? What do you think some of the prerequisites are for cybersecurity threat intelligence to be effective for our organizations?
Yeah, so I guess I'll pause for a second and say it really depends on the organization first, and I think we can talk about that later. In my experience, first of all, there's a difference between information, intelligence, knowledge. As was just said, if we look back 10 years ago, all too often, what people would misquote or talk about intelligence would just be a flat list of indicators. That was sufficient 10 years ago. Nowadays, we really need more enriched information when it comes to good, true threat intelligence. So there needs to be some work put in between layers of automation, AI, machine learning, all that stuff on the data stack can, but also the humans. And really, the context is key. I agree with that. So that is definitely one prerequisite, not just the what, but the why, the how. Ultimately, getting into when we build playbooks, into the attribution, the who piece. So yeah, the context is probably one of the most important pieces today as a prereq. Also having, making sure that it's fresh and agile. Those have to be combined together. I think obviously when we have fresh intelligence, we want to make that agile. We want to put that the rubber to the road, like I said, which leads me to my last prereq, I think, and the most important, and I know we talk about this a lot, is actionable threat intelligence. So we also refer to this as the last mile problem. So when you receive intelligence, how do you cross that last mile? How do you put that intelligence to use? And different organizations have different ways to do that. So that's really important. I guess the last thing I'll also say, and maybe this is more of a processing with intelligence for a prereq, is how do you prioritize that? Because a lot of the times when we talk about automation and intelligence, there's just too much. People kind of roll over with fatigue sometimes, or they're overwhelmed or overloaded. So that's more of a CSO perspective, as how do you start to prioritize the intelligence that you receive when it comes to making that actionable. Sometimes if it's a human applying that intelligence, there's resource and bandwidth issues as well. So I guess four prereqs in my mind there.
And Derek, just to add on to that, you and I go way back from a cybersecurity perspective with the Cyber Threat Alliance. How have you seen the Cyber Threat Alliance and other sharing organizations grow because of this need and these prerequisites that you've identified?
Well, it's been a fantastic journey, specifically with the CTA. It's been a while now. Yeah, it's been going on over 6 years. Yeah. So it's grown with the solutions that we've created, to be honest. Again, I don't think we could have done this 6 years ago. So those things that we mentioned, being agile, putting it to action, we needed technology pieces. We needed languages like, Stix version 2, which grew from older versions of Stix 1.1 as an example, to be able to really, not only describe the things we need to do in a more efficient way, but be able to have a platform to share that and this is very important, I think, on an automation level and a human level. There's both. I look at threat intel as a stack, right? It's like the OSI model. You have at the bottom layer, you have automation, the machine learning and AI, and then humans sitting more on top. So it's escalation paths and how you can pass that up. And that ecosystem, I think, has been created with the Cyber Threat Alliance, which is fantastic.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that insight. Righard, to add on to this, tell us a little bit about what you see from a media perspective and how proper information in and from the media is affecting the productivity of our ecosystem.
Oh, that's a good point you're raising. Proper information from and to the media is really important. Actually, adding on to the topic that Derek just mentioned, the context. Information can be applied when you have threat intelligence from the media and they are not correct. You could actually be more devastating, locking your entire infrastructure down for nothing, or it's incomplete and you start to assume things which can actually make things worse. As an example, people always say you should never pay like for ransomware to the people. Universities have done that, even in the Netherlands, but the context is missing. And if you know that the students already have a really bad year because of COVID-19 pandemic, and now losing all the work, I understand the university paid. Many people don't. Now, what if the university suddenly was on the breakthrough of a COVID-19 vaccine? Then it's only a very small payment to get progress. So the context changes and suddenly the threat intelligence context changes too, and then it's accepted. So the proper information from the media, but also from companies towards the media is really important.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I agree. Context seems to be an overlying theme here because it does also help with the other point that was mentioned earlier on verification too. The more context you have, this with investigation, any investigation too, right? The more trust you can have in it, the more confidence you can have in it.
Yeah, and we've seen that in research as well. Like if like a threat is actually attacking an IP number 10.10.10.10, what does it say? It's an intranet IP, not important. But if it in your organization is the classified document server, a little bit more important. Context.
Yeah, and this is something that actually we, as an example, we reward in the Cyber Threat Alliance for sightings, right? If more than one member sees the same thing, verifies that is still additional context to that, right? It's just another piece of context which helps to make it more reliable.
But I think in the case Righard mentioned, the University of Maastricht that got hit by a ransomware earlier this year. They got it quite well. They sought other media. They held a symposium, and they called for openness and for sharing of threat information on the kind of attacks that they were hit by. So I think in context, if you look towards media attention, if you do it right in the right way of openness and sharing of information, then it can be really productive as well.
Yeah, and if the information in the media is right and really explaining why it has been done, it can even be accepted, or in this case, it makes threat intelligence more acceptable and more understandable as well.
Yeah.
So that leads me to our next question, and I think it's a pretty interesting thing to consider. What is it that sharing this threat intelligence information is helping us to make the work of the cyber adversaries harder?
Yeah, so again, this comes down to the ecosystem to me. So as for the Cyber Threat Alliance, as an example, we can refer to that as an ecosystem, a platform. To me, every member has different backgrounds. There's some overlap for sure, but again, it's about how we, the overarching goal is how do we make it more expensive for cyber criminals to operate. So if you look at it from a strategic standpoint, there's various models and ways to do that, of course, right? If you look at it from a vendor standpoint, it's mitigation, right? So it's resiliency of networks, adding more security controls by making that, intelligence quick, actionable. In other words, making it a pain to cyber criminals to try to get into networks and systems. The more resiliency, they're often, unless we're talking about targeted attacks as well, the lion's or bulk majority of attacks that we see with cybercrime are after the low-hanging fruit. And if they see that there's no low-hanging fruit and there's more resilient networks, they're going to go knocking on someone else's door. That's just one part of the strategy, right? But if we look at how, because if they have to go back to the drawing board and they have to put more R&D resources on their end to create a new piece of malware or a zero-day exploit, that's going to cost money to them, right? So it's the same. So that's one piece to it. The other piece is from looking at it obviously from a disruption standpoint, and we have certain online, so I won't talk too much about that. But that comes down to disruption of infrastructure, right? Trying to take C2 servers offline and infrastructure, how they operate. Again, they have to be forced to make another move. And then obviously there's the attribution piece. So that's going after what I call cutting off the head of the snake, going after the top level of their cyber criminal organizations through attribution. That comes down to law enforcement, prosecution, arrest, which is probably, freezing of assets on their end, which is, I think, one of the toughest things to do, but most rewarding too.
Okay. In addition to the expense, what are some examples you can give to explain the pros and cons of sharing threat intelligence information with law enforcement agencies around the world? What do you think about that, Righard?
Oh, I am actually all in favor of sharing with law enforcement, but as you mentioned, it has pros and cons. Pros, because we can actually get much more done with law enforcement present, taking it down. The con is that it may be way slower to taking it down, because law enforcement has to follow certain protocols. They may do investigations. They may need to take all the evidence into account, official law agreement contracts with different countries. And of course, as long as the bad guys are able to continue, the more money they make. So we could do it faster by not sharing, but it actually pays off to actually share information, because there's a bigger chance that the attribution really works and the bad guys are really being arrested and the whole operation is being taken down. I know that, like Derek just mentioned earlier, we have different views, like different organizations. Derek and I obviously work for a commercial organization where we want to publish our research as well. When that is delayed, that may have a cost. Then again, I think the cost is marginal compared to the benefit of sharing the information.
Yeah, from a authority perspective, the mission of the law enforcement and from the search and certainly our national search is to give our constituency an accurate look into the Dutch threat environment. And we can't do that without information being shared. And we are completely dependent on parties to give us that information so that we can warn other parties in time.
Yeah, and Kathi, I look at it as a reward aspect too. I do think so. Generally when you talk about intelligence sharing, the more stakeholders you bring to the table, you start to bring in other platforms, other backgrounds and frameworks. Which it's a double-edged sword. Sometimes it's a great thing, but sometimes it can make it complicated as well. So that's one of the challenges I'd say we have in the industry is how we can try to make I wouldn't say make it easier, but overcome those challenges. I think those are growing efforts. In my experience, the great news is in the industry, when it comes to this, particularly with law enforcement and certs, is that there's great willingness to work together, which is a really good thing. And there's been a lot of progress made.
And we already overcame the trust issue with the, within the industry when we were competitors. So it's just a small hurdle to overtake, to also have that trust relationship with the law enforcement, that the information stays contained, and give credit where credit is due.
Yeah.
And a lot of what we're talking about here has to do with the technology that we're using to gather information, to kind of sort through that information, that type of thing. What are some of the successes that you can share when it comes to people, person-to-person interaction? So what are some of the things that we're doing from a personal perspective that's also helping in this, and from a law enforcement perspective, or even just overall as an industry?
Well, it all starts with personal trust. Networking is an important part where you first have to meet the people. It is really difficult to start a trust-based relationship with a new entity. We are here in the tips track sponsored by CTA. CTA at one point was new. It was really difficult to really trust CTA because what is it? Who is behind it? Once you have met the people, and they're great people, it is much easier to build a trust relationship and to start sharing information. And then after the first or 2-3 cases, they're not misusing it. So it is easier to keep sharing information, and especially when they're sharing back.
Yeah, exactly. Bidirectional is really important. That's another new prereq I think that we can throw on there, because that's also really important, the giving back aspect. Definitely. Right. Yeah, I think it's key. It's critical. I mean, as Righard has said, we need the human-to-human interaction. You need to meet faces, to meet people. You need to have the growing trust and track records too, because there's obviously, as time goes on, there's going to be new stakeholders introduced through that chain of trust too. So it's really important. And there's also the other piece, Kathi, of humans being able to, as much as we like to think that science and artificial intelligence, machine learning is a great thing, it's really a tool. And so, humans can solve things that machines can't still today. Right. But it's important to have that. It's just, there's different problems and challenges. That's sort of what I meant about that stacked model before. And, a lot of that comes down to these, when events are breaking the strategy, getting on phone calls and talking to each other and trying to come up with a consensus of how we approach a problem and roadmap, things like that.
And I think we've seen some really big successes from a personal interaction perspective in the recent past when it comes to cyber threats. A lot of information about CTI is focused on companies or how organizations should integrate CTI into their processes. Is there a difference between CTI for companies and CTI for national institutions like CERTs?
So I'll start with my view. Obviously, we love to hear the CERT point of view as well. So generally we say cybercrime has no borders, or that's been said in the industry for years, which is generally true. But there are specific use cases for private sector versus public sector. In my experience, there's overlap for sure. There's a need to have the same type of information that's shared. It's just that there's a difference often in the transport mechanism, in the format of that information. Sometimes some people want to speak sticks, some want to speak MISP as an example, some want templated and formatted documents that are sent over. Prosecutors, as an example, will handle things, will understand things and see it in a different level than a security operations center would, typically in the private sector. There's the core of the information, I think, is all that context, everything we need to form is there. It's useful in different aspects and different formats, and the way that it's actionable and applied. So short answer, yes, there is a difference, but long answer is it's still residing on that same, the same core of intelligence, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I agree with Derek. The core of the information stays the same, but I think where organizations can take a look at their assets and form a very clear intel requirement based on that. CERTs don't have that luxury. They have a whole constituency of parties in different sectors on different maturity levels. They have to serve with their information. So it's quite hard, and it can be quite overwhelming to actually collect threat intelligence without any requirements, or with actually all kinds of requirements. So what we do is we made a portfolio, a threat intel portfolio, and that consists of different products, from CTI feeds to quarterly reports on Dutch threats, so that organization can pick, they can choose which product actually gives them intelligence value. And also we build on trust between specialists, the subject which we handled previously, so that the threshold to call us if something happens becomes quite low, and people can know when to contact us, how to contact us, and ask for more threat information on the things they need.
Yeah, I would also just quickly add to that what Noortje says is the is the points of view. I guess that's the other difference, right? So that's attack surface. That's, I call it the threat spectrum. A lot of the times, everyone has different ways of viewing information. So that's more of it comes also to that bidirectional feedback, right? Building exercise. The more that you can share these different pieces of view and combine them together, the more powerful that context can become too.
Absolutely. So the last question I think we have for our conversation this morning is from the title of our panel here, Flattening the Curve of Cyber Risks. With the COVID-19 pandemic going on in our world at the moment, how has that affected CTI and our organizations, and what do we anticipate changing as people eventually head back into the safe harbor of their corporate networks in the office? What are some of the things we should be on the lookout for, and what can we expect going forward?
Oh, well, let me go to the final part of the question. What happens when people move back into the office, because everybody is working from home. Smart home equipment is selling like crazy. People are installing it, the apps on their phone, and they're bringing in those phones into your corporate network again. And all those phones now are starting to make connections to third-party clouds for like the doorbell, the cameras. Mm-hmm. Do you really want that in your corporate environment, that suddenly a lot of third-party clouds are being accessed? I think that is going to be one of the most important points to really pay attention to.
Yeah, I think that's a good one, Righard. And I think, I actually don't think people will fully return to the office. I think that people are still working from home from now on, now that we see how things actually can work. Mm-hmm. So I think it's extra important to have safe connections from home to the office networks. And I think people should be watching towards threats to the availability of those connections.
Yeah, Righard, I have visions of that wooden horse being rolled into the castle when you talk about that. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, and you know, to Noortje's point, I think it's going to be a hybrid model going forward. Not everyone is going to return to the office, but you know, I always with any sort of event like this, I always like to see opportunity, the bright side of things too. Obviously, there are a lot of challenges that we have right now, but one thing that you know that's this pandemic has done, I think, is bring a lot of things to the table. It's made it very visible to people as to the problems that's happening. It's forced organizations to rather quickly, which is not always a good thing, but at least shift to you know, new security measures for these devices that are starting to be outside of those corporate safeguards for an extended period of time now. So you know, there's an education aspect to it. So the education, I think, is starting to ramp up. You know, the vendors have been doing a lot of campaigns on COVID-19 threats as an example. Law enforcement, Interpol has their Wash Their Cyber Hands campaign as an example. All these things coming together, that ecosystem of stakeholders, I think is having an impact. We've actually seen COVID-19 phishing lures drop off since March and April as an example. But other things take their place. So going into what we can expect moving forward is it's not going to stop. There's always going to be that flavor of the day. And but the good news is, because as an example, it's trying to see an impact measure that success and seeing cyber criminals shift their tactics means what we're doing is having an impact and a success. It goes back to that, making it more expensive, which helps to reduce or flatten the curve, I think, with cyber risk.
Awesome. Were there any final thoughts that any of you wanted to share with our viewers and our listeners this morning? Okay. Well, I thank you all. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I didn't wait long enough.
Stay safe.
Stay safe.
Yes, absolutely. Stay
safe.
Yes. And I thank all of you today for joining us. We touched on some pretty important topics this morning. And as the world is an ever-changing place, so are our adversaries. So it's something that we need to stay on top of. And I look forward to what the future has in store for us in the realm of cybersecurity and risk management. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, Kathi, for moderating.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Great conversation.